Hello, Chris.
What's up, Jason?
Back from vacation.
Yeah, how was it?
It's great until I came home.
Why is that?
Because my our parents ruined our kids. So
I could see that. You
yeah,
didn't come back feeling super energized and everything?
no. Also, I was like, we had really bad turbulence on the way to Vegas, and so like the whole way home, I was like checking the turbulence forecast, like just waiting for the plane to nosedive into the ground.
Oh no, that's kind of rough.
But while I was there, it was great. So
Well, hopefully you'll get back in the groove of things then.
yeah, it feels good. How about you? What's going on?
Oh, not too much. I forget what I did this weekend. Oh, I went and visited my parents this weekend, so feels a little bit like I had a mini vacation. So
Is that because you guys went on a mini trip?
no, not one yet, but we'll have some soon when the weather gets better.
I don't know that anyone knows about your
My Mini Cooper
yeah,
deal.
it's like a family tradition.
We'll have to talk about that some other time.
So today, I am really excited, as is Chris, for the guests we have on. And we actually, for the first time, there are four of us total. So I will let our two guests, if you guys don't mind, just introducing yourselves.
Hey, everybody, I'm Sam Stephenson. You might know me on the internet as S. Stephenson. I've been in the Rails world for a while, since 2004, I think, and I work at Basecamp.
And I'm Javan Makhmali. I also work at Basecamp with Sam. I contribute to Rails somewhat infrequently and to a number of Basecamp's open source JavaScript projects.
Cool. How did you guys get started in programming in general?
Sam, actually, if you want to take this one first, I'm going to mute for 1 second. Sorry, I'm having some audio glitches on my end, but I'll be right back.
I think I got started, was definitely in elementary school. I was fortunate enough to have access to a computer, and our school library had a book on basic programming, and I picked that up and devoured it before I could figure out how to even run the basic interpreter. And it just ended up having a lot of fun figuring out that I could type some things in and have the computer do my bidding. And I think that interest blossomed throughout elementary and middle and high school. I went off to college for computer science education and found it to be a little too vocational. So I dropped out and was following along on the Ruby mailing list around that time. And I think this was around 2003. And just really into the Ruby language. And came across a post by this guy, David Heinemeier Hansen, announcing a new web framework. And I kind of touched on all of my interests at the time, and I got started contributing back to the open source project, and that's how we initially met, and that's how I got started. Eventually, working for 37 Signals, which then became Basecamp later on.
So are you, like, when I hear the story of like Basecamp, there's like four employees. Are you like one of the original four?
I think I was employee number 5 or 6.
Okay. That's awesome. I didn't realize you had been with 37 Signals so long.
Yeah, I joined 37 Signals in December of 2005.
That's
Awesome.
like the whole history of the internet, basically, in that time frame. I joined Basecamp, I think, let's see, I don't remember the year, but I think it was just about 8 years ago. And Sam was already a veteran there. But I guess backing up a little bit too, my history before that, I think like a lot of people in our industry, was just kind of learning on my own. The majority of my programming knowledge to date has just been through work experience or just experimentation on my own. I went to a community college program in Ann Arbor, Michigan, where I'm from, that kind of got me started on like a professional track. I'm doing like air quotes, but the bulk of like what I've learned and that I still apply and use today has just been through experience, either in open source or at work.
Awesome. So before I kind of delve more, I guess, into some of the other questions, what are your roles? Like, what are your titles, I guess, at Basecamp?
My title is programmer.
Same.
That makes this next question a little easier. So I see a lot of recently, like, kind of front end related open source libraries coming out of Basecamp. I'm thinking like, TurboLinks, Stimulus of the more recent. And typically, and correct me if I'm wrong, I see kind of both of you as the faces of these projects. So I was just kind of curious if you wouldn't mind kind of sharing the process of how you like go from an idea to building the library to open sourcing it.
Yeah, that's a good question. So Javan and I are on a team at Basecamp called Research and Fidelity. And we're tasked with doing research type work, such as working on open source frameworks, and also keeping the bar high on on our applications in terms of the front end experience and just making sure everything is polished and works well. And that extends also to the development experience. So not only do we want to make sure we have a good experience for our customers, but also for everyone else at the company who works on the app. I think we may be a little bit different than most other organizations because we have designers and developers working on the same code base, right? And the same, the same files. The designers will go in and write Rails controllers and stub them out. They'll implement their own ERB templates, and programmers will go in and fill in the missing pieces and kind of go back and forth in a virtuous cycle until whatever they're working on ships. And so it's very important for us to invest in tooling to make that possible. And I think a lot of our work comes from just seeing that the frameworks that are out there, libraries and frameworks that are out there, are geared towards a much different type of organization than the one we work at.
Did you guys always have that sort of process where designers would be more technical, or is that something you guys stumbled into over the years?
As long as I can remember, it's basically every feature at 37 Signals or Basecamp rather has started with design first, and that means an actual HTML mock-up of whatever is being built.
Okay, yeah, I remember watching like Ryan Singer talk about designing stuff and then just like building it out in HTML in one of his talks a long time ago, and I always thought that was really cool because it kind of allows you to iterate in sort of in a real environment instead of Photoshop or something.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which I thought was pretty interesting, but I feel like you don't see that a lot in other companies.
I can't say I haven't worked at many other places, but it just based on what I read and the way other frameworks and libraries work, it seems to be a much different style of development.
It kind of sounds like the dream to me. Like, I don't mind like working in HTML by any means, but having like someone who like has an eye for it to actually like write out HTML sounds amazing.
I think it goes both ways too. Most often, new features will be design led, and they'll get something pretty much either working like good enough to ship to production or almost ready and a programmer can step in. But there are also times when a programmer might start first on a smaller feature, and I think pretty often they'll go in the other direction and try to basically take the design as far as they can go and then hand it off to a designer to polish things. I know that's the way I like to work. I feel like HTML is kind of our common language, and designers and programmers kind of work on either side of it, and we're constantly sort of reaching over into the other's territory to learn. I feel like I get better the more I try to do a little bit of the designer's work, and the designers get better at programming the more they step into our territory. So there's definitely no clear line like your job is done, now it's this person's job. I think everyone's encouraged to do as much as they can on their own and then get help when they need it.
Gotcha. Yeah. It just reminded me of like, there's been times in the past where I've worked with a designer who will give me a PSD or something, and then you realize like, well, what happens if the text is like 10 times as long or something or whatever? And those I feel like those moments are always kind of interesting, because if the designer isn't thinking about sort of how things will work when they're implemented, then they can end up with a design that you can't really use because you've got to modify it. I just imagine that helps make the process going back and forth between design and coding a whole lot more seamless in a sense.
Absolutely. I think that's really the magic of HTML, is that you don't need anything more than a text editor to go in there and see what it's going to look like with say a long name or, whatever kind of data you can imagine.
So are you guys doing a lot more front end stuff now? Or are you still doing Ruby somewhat?
I like to call myself Ruby adjacent. I got my start in the Ruby world and still love it. But pretty much all of my work over the past decade, I would say, has been in JavaScript or other languages, trying to maybe bring the Ruby ethos to other parts of the development experience.
I'm pretty much in the same boat as Sam. I mean, I think Sam and I both work on actual product features, Basecamp features, and when we do, we work in Ruby the same as anyone else, and we'll take features, fully to production. So, but the majority, I'd say 90% of the code I write these days is JavaScript.
So speaking kind of the Ruby ethos, kind of in like JavaScript's a good example. I assume you've written, probably both of you, quite a bit of CoffeeScript, which kind of feels, like a little bit like the Ruby of JavaScript, at least to me. But recently there's been a lot of transition away from CoffeeScript to JavaScript, especially I guess with like Webpacker and Babel. Kind of like, what are your thoughts on that?
I think CoffeeScript was a huge success. It basically showed the world the viability of source-to-source compilation for JavaScript. Taking one language and turning it into JavaScript that is more or less a one-to-one mapping. And I don't think that we would have... I think if you look at most of the features in ES6 now that people really love, they all are... they directly come from CoffeeScript. Things like the REST operator, destructuring assignment, class syntax largely is inspired by CoffeeScript. But I think it's great that the community has come together and standardized on some of those things. And it's undeniable that people like them.
Yeah, I feel I've definitely noticed a lot of the conveniences there that you had in CoffeeScript that were just kind of more natural because it was more like writing your Ruby code with classes and everything. Now you don't have to worry too much about what context is the keyword this and everything. Do you guys are you guys switching most everything over to Webpacker and Babel? Like I know you were doing tricks and turbolinks and action text and a lot of JavaScript projects. Are those all getting transitioned over, or are some of them staying in CoffeeScript?
I can start to take that one on. So for our application code, Basecamp, just application JavaScript, we write Babel transpiled, just pretty much vanilla ES6, and use Webpacker. And we took the approach of basically writing new JavaScript that way and leaving all of our existing CoffeeScript code just in place and deciding not to really add to that, but continue to just basically put it in maintenance mode. And then we definitely have some, like Tricks is one of our older JavaScript libraries that's open source, and that's all CoffeeScript. And we don't have any plans to just blanket rewrite in another dialect now or plain JavaScript, simply just because it's a lot of work. It's a big project, and we may get there someday. But new work like Stimulus is mostly being done in TypeScript, and I'm sure Sam can expand on that.
Yeah, Stimulus is TypeScript, and we just recently converted Turbolinks to TypeScript as well.
Yeah, I saw the commit for that. How did the transition go? And for anyone that doesn't know, what is TypeScript and why did you choose it?
TypeScript is essentially ES6 with optional type annotations. And one of the things that type annotations give you is, or at least in TypeScript, they give you the option of being able to know at any point in the code where something might be null or undefined. And in my experience, that's about half of the issues you run into writing JavaScript. So that in itself is a huge advantage. But the other big advantage is that you get amazing editor integration. So TypeScript has a language service, is what they call it, that integrates with various editors and allows you to do things like right-click on a class name or method name and get a list of all the places that that method or class is definitively being referenced, and vice versa. And then it just makes it very easy to rename things, which is something I do a lot when I'm working, trying to find the right name for something. I'll go back and forth between sometimes half a dozen different names. Being able to do that in the editor without really thinking about it is a huge advantage. And so in my experience, building frameworks, TypeScript is really, really good for that kind of thing, because you really are just getting confidence. You're getting confidence that you know what everything is at every moment, and confidence in refactoring.
This is an interesting thing that we were just talking about in Slack was, there's a lot of movement towards types with TypeScript and just kind of in general, people talking about languages with types. How do you feel about that versus, Ruby where it's duck typed and we don't have type hinting or anything like that?
I see types in. Let me walk that back a minute.
One of the things that I find, interesting is like in your JavaScript, a lot of this is kind of like silent errors. So when you have problems in JavaScript, it feels like they're more crucial in a sense because you may not know that your customers are having issues unless you have, JavaScript error monitoring. But
That's exactly right.
you're much more likely on server side to detect things.
Right. On the server side, you'll quite easily get a notification when there's an exception. On the client side, you often don't. And there's a large class of errors that can be detected and avoided statically by virtue of annotating your code with types. And I think there's a good argument to be made for whether for the just debating the merits of the ergonomics of type annotations. And I think it's likely that in the future we'll have to do less and less manual annotation. But I'm not a compiler engineer. I think for me, I see types as a form of editor metaprogramming. I'm getting knowledge at edit time instead of runtime about the code.
That's definitely interesting.
That's one of the things I've been most interested about types in is not necessarily, I mean, yes, nice for the like nil checking, things like that, or null checks for a program. But I'm really interested in all the tooling you can do around like statically typed languages. Like you said, like editor features, things like that. Like I've never worked outside of like Java in a static language, so I don't really know. I could just be speaking ignorantly. But like what you talk about TypeScript is like kind of what I wish I had more of.
What I like about TypeScript is that they are trying to model everything that people already do with JavaScript. So it's not, it's not imposing a new model of programming really. And that means if you're passing around objects between method calls, for example, objects that don't have to be instances of classes. Let's just say you have an object that has 3 properties and maybe one of them is optional. You can quite easily specify that as a type in TypeScript. And the thing is, the types are already there, whether you're annotating them or not. The annotations just help you make more sense of them.
I think the on the receiving end, types can be quite welcome too. Like if you're writing a stimulus application, not working on stimulus itself, and you're using an editor that supports the types that are exported along with stimulus, you get really great IDE auto-completion for the full stimulus API, just for example. But this is any library that uses TypeScript or exports TypeScript compatible type files. So you get, it's a more almost Java-like IDE in that you get amazing inference and auto-completion while you're working. But it definitely takes more work up front to build the library that way. I know I've been frustrated at my own pace sometimes with TypeScript. Feels like it gets in the way a little bit when you're just trying to figure something out. But the great thing is you can just kind of back away from that and with TypeScript, write plain JavaScript and then sort of work backwards and annotate all the necessary types.
What editor are you guys using that has integrations with the TypeScript stuff?
Yeah, Visual Studio Code pretty much exclusively for TypeScript.
I'm also using VS Code.
I've been using Atom for a really long time for almost everything else, and I still turn back to it for basically everything but TypeScript. But I could easily switch over full time.
This is like the first time I feel like I'm in a like-minded group of text editor people. I'm usually around like Vim experts and not just feel like the Talladega Nights, like Ricky Bobby, like I don't know what to do with my hands right now.
The Holy War.
I was just going to ask you guys, one thing I've always found interesting about your sort of like philosophy on front end JavaScript code is to kind of keep things lightweight and vanilla JavaScript in a sense. I mean, you're using CoffeeScript and TypeScript and stuff, but you're not obviously going for any of these new hot frameworks or anything. You want to talk a little bit about your philosophy on how you build out your front end features?
Well,
Javan, you want to take that one?
sure. Yeah. I mean, I think most of the JavaScript libraries, tooling, et cetera, that we've built have been, specifically for the style of application development that we do more broadly. That being, Rails on the back end, server rendered HTML for the most part, pretty much the same way that we've been building applications for, 10 plus years. We've kind of had the unique opportunity to work on, Basecamp, the application, but really it's like 3 iterations on it. There's Basecamp 1, 2, and 3 are both all 3 in production still. Basecamp 1 being the first Rails app, and then 2 and 3 came later. And they're more or less all built the same way. If you look at all the Ruby code, like the Rails controller code looks identical, and it's different code, but the structure is all the same in all 3. And we've just kind of adapted the front end to be more modern, more performant, while keeping this easy, same old structure that we've had forever. So that said, we've written JavaScript libraries to work with server rendered HTML for the most part. And we take on the assumption that the HTML could appear on the page in any number of ways, and we don't want to think about how that HTML got there. It could be a full page load. It could be a TurboLinks page change. Could be some partial AJAX insertion or another JavaScript library inserting its own DOM nodes. From a development standpoint, we don't want to think about any of that. We just want to decorate our HTML with some small to medium amount of behavior when it appears. And that's pretty much been the same since the beginning, but how we've done it has evolved over time into basically Stimulus today.
I remember a blog post of yours, or someone at Basecamp wrote one about using like a data behavior tag or an attribute to kind of just generically define, like, I don't care what element it is on the page, but I just want to say that, my JavaScript should look for this and then apply these features to it, which seem like the natural extension that Stimulus grew into. Is that kind of what happened? Like, because it seems, for the most part, the same kind of thought process with decorate your elements. Doesn't matter if they're buttons or selects or divs or whatever. You can make them interchangeable and move them around, but you can still kind of apply the same features there.
Data behavior is definitely, I think, where the idea for Stimulus came from. To expand on that a little bit, data behavior is just an attribute that we picked. I think this was around the time of Basecamp 2. And the idea was to get away from using class names, CSS class names, to specify JavaScript behavior using the unobtrusive JavaScript patterns, mostly because there was no easy way to know whether a class name referred to presentation or to something that was controlled by JavaScript. And so we just picked a different attribute and set up a system where we, at various points in the code, when something on the page changes, we would check to see if there are any new data behavior attributes and look inside that attribute for a token. And depending on what the token was, we would do something like install an event listener or perform some kind of rewrite or whatever it may be, any kind of dynamic behavior. And I think over time that grew pretty unwieldy, especially when you have several different developers and designers all working on the same thing. It just kind of turns into a big soup of behavior tokens that we've sprinkled throughout the page. And I think that the general idea is good, but clearly needed a little more structure. And that's what we were trying to get at with Stimulus.
Cool. Yeah, I've really enjoyed using Stimulus for like basically you're kind of writing stuff like you would with jQuery, but or just regular JavaScript, but you like don't have to define all your event listeners and all of that stuff. Could you explain how the mutation observer stuff works behind the scenes to make this stuff work?
Yeah, I'd actually before there was Stimulus, we had starting in Basecamp 3, we began using Mutation Observer to install these data behaviors. And that allowed us to remove, it allowed us to make things a little more robust. It didn't matter. We didn't need to, for example, hook into jQuery events or things like that to figure out what new behaviors needed to be installed. Rather, we were just keeping an internal mapping of which elements had these attributes, when they changed, and what needed to be done. And I think around 2015, maybe, I started working on a library called Sentinella, which was essentially an extraction of Basecamp's Mutation Observer system, and worked on that for a while, and then it eventually became Stimulus. But the original design was a little bit different. But the way the mutation observers work is we wrap the mutation observer API at the very lowest level and turn it into what we call an element observer. And then on top of element observer, we have an attribute observer, which monitors for changes to any specific attribute name. And on top of that, we have what we call a token list observer. And a token list in DOM nomenclature is essentially like the class attribute. It's a white space separated list of tokens. And we use that for a couple of different things in Stimulus. But everything is essentially built on top of that. We're just watching attributes with specific names, waiting for those attributes to change, detecting which tokens were inserted or deleted or whatever, and then mapping that at a high level to controllers and actions and targets.
I actually had no idea how that worked. So it just was magic to me.
It's a really, the Mutation Observer API is really beautiful. And so many things are possible now that we have it. And it's actually been around for quite a while. But yeah, I'm really glad we have it.
I believe it's natively supported down to IE 11 without any sort of polyfills. So you get pretty wide browser support for free. And it's certainly cleaned up the worst parts of our JavaScript code. Prior to using it, we basically relied on a list of events like DOM content loaded or Turbolinks events or some custom events. And whenever any one of them would fire, we'd more or less scan the whole DOM looking for relevant, say data behavior attributes and install behavior. And now we basically just get a callback when relevant elements appear or disappear. And it's a night and day difference.
Yeah, it seems like a much simpler way to do things. So I work for a company called Podia, and we're Rails app, kind of through and through. Right as I joined, they released a pretty large feature that's built mostly on stimulus. So this next question is a little self-serving because I write a ton of stimulus now. Uh, what are some ideas or things we could maybe even look forward to that y'all have for stimulus for the future?
One of the things we're working on, and I know I've emailed with Chris about this in particular, is expanding our API for accessing data attributes that hang off of controller elements. And we have an open pull request for that right now. It's pending some documentation changes, but will eventually be merged. But the idea is to make it easier to access commonly used data. And one of the most common types of data that we've found in our own usage in Basecamp is just passing CSS classes. And an example of why you'd want to do that is, for example, applying, let's say, a busy indicator to a particular element while it's undergoing some kind of request. If you want to write your controller in a generic or reusable way, that you might not be using that same class name from one component to the next. So we allow you to specify something like data busy class on your element, and then easily access that from within your controller, which you can then pass to the DOM APIs for adding or removing class names. And then another thing that we're doing is adding support for other types of data. So numbers, strings, booleans, objects, and arrays. You can specify those as data attributes, and they'll automatically be decoded for you in your stimulus controller. And building on the mutation observer API, we have a callback. So anytime any of those attributes changes, you can implement a method in your controller and react to those changes.
That's awesome. Going back to the different types, you mentioned Boolean, which just today I had a data attribute and I just gave it a string because of true.
Mm-hmm.
And so does that mean in a future update, when I give it true as a string, it'll convert it to a Boolean?
Exactly. Yeah.
I'm so excited.
It also means you can treat those as properties in your class. So you can give that attribute a logical name and refer to it as a property on the instance, assign to it or read from it. And it'll automatically serialize to and from the DOM.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that because, along with the mutation observer listening to when those change, you could do that where, like you said, a busy status, you could have a status as one of your extra parameters there and then just change that. And then your stimulus controller could go ahead and update it kind of automatically,
Exactly.
noticing that change, which would be incredibly cool. So it's in a way React and Vue have all this state management stuff, but in a way, it's kind of just use your attributes in the DOM as your state and store and just monitor those. And that's kind of how stimulus does the same sort of things, I guess, if that makes sense. Is that right?
I would say the fundamental difference between stimulus and most of the other frameworks is that we treat the DOM as the source of truth. All your state lives in the DOM. And I think maybe people were kind of burned by the jQuery, just manipulate anything whenever you want philosophy, and moved kind of across to the other end of the spectrum and said, okay, well, we're going to put everything in a JavaScript object internally. We're going to fetch it from JSON and keep it in memory, and we'll just render HTML from the client side, and it doesn't matter what's in there or what it looks like. And that is very much incompatible with our development style, because we do most of our rendering on the server side. And so for us, it's a way of just bridging that gap.
Yeah, speaking of rendering, just recently I made a little screencast, an example of kind of, I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with the Cocoon gem, but having a way to dynamically add, say, a question and answers in the same form. Do you guys have any advice on ways to approach the sort of dynamic template stuff in that sense? What I ended up doing was I used fields for all the existing items in the database, and then I did an extra fields for inside of a template tag that was a brand new answer that was empty, and then I could use that to populate in my stimulus controller, just insert new ones whenever you click that from a template. Is that something that you guys do often or kind of discourage? Because I know in a sense you could just make a round trip to the server and grab a partial and insert that onto the page pretty easily. So maybe that's what you would recommend more, or I'm just curious to hear what your thoughts are on that stuff.
I actually just did the same thing that you did. I'm working on a feature that needs to basically dynamically add small little partials of HTML, and I used the template tag and made it a target, and the controller code, finds that template element as a target and then just clones its contents. And so this is it's like a autocomplete widget where the selected values kind of stack up as little rendered chunks of HTML. And I was really happy with the outcome there, in part because the template HTML is all in the same file. Like it could have easily been like a rendered client side, or using a template string in the controller code, something like that. But you lose that connection from the source HTML. So we haven't really addressed the issue of, well, not the issue, but the various approaches of dynamic rendering or client-side rendering with Stimulus itself. I think we purposefully leave that up to you. And I wouldn't say we discourage it in any way, but Stimulus just really isn't the tool for doing that. But I just kind of +1 to your template approach. I think that's like a really nice pairing with the just the thinking behind Stimulus and the desire to have your HTML kind of in one place and annotated expressly. I'm not sure if I would use it again if I had to do a lot of dynamic sort of updates within that template. You know what I mean? Like if I needed to interpolate a bunch of data within it. But I think it's a great way to go for simple use cases.
Yeah, that's great to hear, because I felt as I was doing it, it's perfect for a simple use case where mine was just a text field. And then it was like, well, if you were doing something like a common example might be something like a country drop down and then the states change based upon the country you selected or whatever. That might be more of one where you would just have a controller that makes an AJAX request to get the template, and you could just render that template HTML server side and insert that or something. because it felt like, if you had to do too much dynamic rendering of things, it would kind of get a little bit out of hand pretty quickly.
I think the other thing that I don't know if people overlook this option, but there's so much you can do just by hiding and revealing content with CSS, content that was always there. It just needed to be toggled in some way using class names or the hidden attribute, etc. There's really nothing wrong with over rendering a little bit on the server side and revealing content as needed that way. I mean, it doesn't scale to a certain point if the amount of content is, enormous and you need to list every city in every country, etc. But for a lot of cases, I know I've deleted a fair number of stimulus controllers throughout Basecamp code and just replaced it with CSS.
So that's an approach we actually took. I think like we got from Basecamp in terms of like caching too. Like we just render out maybe more HTML than we need, so we can cache it and then use like CSS, like just use it to show and hide things, and it's worked really well for us.
I think that's an extremely underappreciated approach. It's worked really well for us.
It's worked since like the beginning of the web, basically. It's battle hardened.
Yeah, that's funny. I remember a post from Basecamp somewhere that was like talking about rendering, like just a little form of checking who to add to a project or something. And it was like, well, why wouldn't you just render everyone and then with CSS hide yourself? Because you're not going to add yourself for even the existing people. But if you do render everyone, then you can cache that one time and you never have to spend time processing that again unless you add or remove people from your team. And I was like, oh, that's such a great, simple approach to things. And just a little CSS takes care of all of that for you, and you could take advantage of all that caching.
Absolutely. And that's a great example of the power of data attributes as well. Annotate each one of those elements, each one of those people with a data person ID attribute, for example. And then you can hard code a CSS class at the top of your HTML file that says, with your current person ID in there, create a CSS selector that matches that and hides that element, for example. Or use a stimulus controller to read that data attribute and remove the element from the page, or whatever it is.
Do you deal with any flickering on that, or do you hide it by default and then display things?
I think there's a lot to unpack in that question with regard to flickering, but
fair enough.
Mutation Observer fires within a microtask, rather changes to the DOM trigger Mutation Observer updates within the microtask queue, which means that they happen not synchronously, but within the same tick of the event loop. So that if you're responding with JavaScript to a Mutation Observer callback, you effectively are able to make any kind of change you want to the DOM without a paint being thrown in the middle. So,
okay, I didn't realize that. That's super cool and like an important little piece of why all this works well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I feel like there was always the uproar of people that were like, Rails new skip turbo links. But I feel like with Stimulus, it just makes it so easy to just go ahead and use Stimulus and turbolinks, and everything just works really well now. It's like a very welcome improvement to have now that I wish we had years ago,
It has been kind of the missing piece, and they are very much designed to work together, even though they don't depend on each other at all, or even use events to communicate with each other. They just They just work by virtue of Mutation Observer. But yeah, it's definitely been a battle to kind of improve the public perception of turbolinks. I think a lot of people are warming back up to the idea now, though, of server rendered HTML and a progressively enhanced alternative to single page applications.
I actually see turbolinks used like in other server side languages now too. Like I have a fair amount of like PHP people I follow, and I like see them talking about turbolinks. I was like, oh, that's neat.
Yeah, I think I've seen the Laravel community has, or at least a certain segment of it, has adopted turbolinks. I know the Phoenix community also has seen some success with it. So that's great.
So before I ask a question and look like an idiot, I'm going to ask a precursor question. You're both pretty involved with turbolinks, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, we both work on turbolinks and stimulus and tricks.
Okay. So there's one project or I guess really technically two projects I'm really curious about how they kind of came to life, and that's TurboLinks iOS and TurboLinks Android. I guess I'm curious, like, whose idea was that, and like, how did you work together with like these your iOS and Android devs to build those?
Yeah, that's a great question. Development for the iOS and Android adapters started almost at the same time as work for TurboLinks 5, which I think was around 2015. 2015. We were working on Basecamp 3 at the time. Basecamp 3 shipped in October of 2015, I believe. And we had a homegrown solution to the problem of how do you fit a TurboLinks application into a native shell, native mobile wrapper. And due to various architectural reasons that are not that interesting to talk about, the previous TurboLinks codebase didn't work very well for that. And so we knew that we had to rewrite it in a way that the control over what we called visiting could be extracted out into a separate object, which could then be implemented by a native adapter. And so we started with a proof of concept, TurboLinks 5, early that summer, and then worked to get it, working pretty well in the browser, and then implemented the iOS adapter. And that was mostly me and a programmer at Basecamp named Jeff Hardy. And we taught ourselves Swift at the time, and we had a little previous experience working with Cocoa before, and so it wasn't that much of a stretch, I guess, for us. But we figured out how to make the web view do our bidding, and really what we wanted there was to efficiently use the web view to present Basecamp in a native wrapper. And for us, that means using so the benefit of using TurboLinks is essentially that you use a single process for visiting multiple pages, and that's where most of the speed comes from. And so to extend that to a native interface means you want to continue to use a single web view across a number of screens, even if those screens are presented natively. So we developed a way that the web view could move from controller to controller, mostly transparently. And then Dan Kim, our Android programmer, ported that to Android. And we managed to get that mostly finished before the public launch of Basecamp, and then took another few months to document everything and get it ready for public release.
I'm just so enamored by that project. Like, it's just really cool to me.
It was really fun to work on, I will say. I think we all, there was a lot of doubt that it would work. But having had some experience with working with UI WebView, WK WebView in the past, I was pretty sure we would be able to do it. And yeah, it has served us well for a few years. And we're now starting work on TurboLinks 6. So,
well, I feel like I have to ask now, what can we expect from TurboLinks 6?
I can't make any promises, and we're still very much in the development phase. But one of the gaps we're hoping to close is lack of form support in TurboLinks. Currently, we kind of rely on your application having some sort of JavaScript running to handle form submissions and to turn those into AJAX requests. So, for example, in Basecamp, we use the Rails UJS adapter to do that. But that it takes some hacks to be able to detect when, for example, a form has been successfully submitted. And there are plenty of times when you want to know when that's happened. For example, if you're presenting something modally, you want to know that a form is successfully submitted so that you can dismiss the modal. And so we're working through some of the scenarios there and trying to figure out a good solution for baking that into TurboLinks itself.
It's funny you mentioned that because I'm pretty sure I was one of the people that opened up that ticket on TurboLinks way back when. Yeah, that's been that's just a naturally like tough problem to solve, because if you like, there's some simple things like if you submit a form and the response is successful, you can just use a TurboLinks visit to the new URL. But if it fails, you could return a document back, maybe, or you can do, a JavaScript response. But then what happens if you get a 500 error? How do you then, insert that? But you don't want that to have any of the styles that TurboLinks is kind of already cached for you in the browser. You want that to kind of clear everything out like a normal request so you can display your error page in its own design and everything. So there's a lot more to it, I think, than people realized.
Yeah, it's a pretty hairy problem, but I'm confident that we'll be able to arrive at something that works for most people most of the time.
That's really exciting to hear about, because when that was kind of added, I was like, man, the scaffolds have local is true set, so they're not submitting with Ajax, but how cool would it be to, spawn a new Rails app that has all of your forms submit with Ajax, so then it works automatically with the native adapters, so that everything is just kind of smooth out of the box. That will be a super cool thing to have when that lands.
Well, Chris, maybe we can get you to write our marketing copy.
I'd be happy to.
Well, I don't want to take up any more time. Chris, do you have any final questions or anything you're itching to know about?
Oh no, that was the teaser for TurboLinks 6 was all I needed.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for being here, guys.
Sorry to put you on the spot with the TurboLinks 6 question. Just got excited.
I love to talk about it.
Thank you both so much.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks, Jason and Chris.
Thanks not only for being here, but just all your work that
absolutely
you share with all of us. It really does make our lives a lot better. So thank you.
Well, that's great to hear.
Yeah, thank you. It's nice to hear things like that, because we all probably don't tell these tool makers in our lives nice things often enough. We just open GitHub issues. So it's a good reminder like of how good it feels to tell someone that and to hear it.
Yeah, and a lot of your people who are using this are customers who don't even know the work that you've done to make those features, and so the only people you get to hear from are the developers being like, hey, there's a problem, or I didn't use this right and it doesn't work. And so yeah, we thank you so much for all the work you guys have done. It's kind of, it's weird to probably hear, but like, you are working on the stuff that we now do for a living, which is awesome.
Well,
That's really
the
cool.
kind words.
If you want to be found on the internet, where can people find you?
You can still find me on Twitter. My name's Javan, Javan. That's my Twitter handle as well.
I've
That's the best
personally
place.
stepped off of Twitter lately, but I'm on GitHub. My username there is SSTEPHENSON.
So just open a TurboLinks issue and mention
Yes.
Sam, and it'll go straight to him.
That sounds awesome and awful. Ooh. Well, once again, thank you so much. If you maybe when TurboLink 6 comes out, if y'all are itching to talk about it, we're ready to have you back on.
I'd love to.
Sweet.
Chris, wrap it up, and I guess I'll talk to you soon.
All right. See you later.